Yesterday, a judge at the High Court England ruled the policy of discharging positive and untested COVID patients into care homes was unlawful, unreasonable and irrational. It was described as one of the most devastating policy failures in the modern era that cost lives. Does the First Minister accept that her decision to send untested and positive patients into care homes in Scotland was unlawful, unreasonable, irrational and cost lives?
First Minister.
No, I don't accept that, although these are matters now rightly and properly that will be scrutinised by the public inquiry that is underway in Scotland and, of course, the parallel public inquiry that will take place into these matters UK-wide. And, of course, these are matters that will be rightly and properly scrutinised should any legal cases be brought in Scotland. I think the most important thing I want to say today is that my thoughts are with every single family who has lost a loved one during the course of the pandemic, in care homes and indeed across wider society. We're obviously aware of the ruling at the High Court yesterday regarding decisions made by the UK Secretary of State for England. The priority of all of us during this pandemic has been to save lives at all points, and we have sought to take the best decisions based on the best scientific and clinical evidence that we had at any given time. All nations developed guidance based on what we understood at the time. The guidance in Scotland is broadly similar to the guidance that was in place in England, but not identical. There were some differences in the versions of the guidance. One of the things that our guidance emphasised from the 13th of March and the 26th of March 2020 was that residents should remain in their rooms so far as possible and routine visiting should be suspended. We also required isolation from the 26th of March of anyone discharged to a care home who had been in contact with COVID cases, even if they were not displaying symptoms. It is right and proper that these matters are fully scrutinised by the public inquiry. The last thing I would say, Presiding Officer, is that, and I've said it before, there is nothing anybody in this chamber will say to me that makes me feel the weight of these decisions any heavier than I already do and will do for every day of the rest of my life. I took all of these decisions, as did my ministers, as did the government, in good faith, based on the best information we had at the time.
Hannah Sarwar.
I'm sorry, but that last part is fine in words, but actually the extraordinary and unthinkable answer that we don't accept the judgment, particularly when the almost identical thing happened in Scotland. And let's look at what the judgment makes clear. Irrational, unreasonable and lawful, given what governments knew. So let's look at what happened in Scotland. As early as the 4th of February, this government's advisers were suggesting that asymptomatic transmission was a possibility. On the 13th of February, this government's advisers were saying that asymptomatic transmission was likely. On the 13th of March, despite warnings from care home staff, this government's guidance said do not hinder discharge from hospitals. On the 26th of March, this government's guidance said individuals being discharged from hospital do not routinely need confirmation of a negative COVID test. As late as the 17th of April, this government's health secretary was saying there was still not a strong case to test patients before discharge, even though testing guidelines had changed in England on the 15th of April. And by the time the government changed their guidance and guidelines on the 21st of April, nearly 3,000 untested people and 75 known positive cases had already been transferred into Scotland's care homes. Does the First Minister accept, in the words of the families affected and impacted, that this was a shameful, unforgivable criminal act that cost lives in Scotland?
First Minister.
My thoughts will be with bereaved families every single day of the rest of my life. This is not about not accepting a judgment. The Scottish Government will look very carefully at the terms of the judgment. Yesterday we've already started that process, but this was not a case about the situation in Scotland, and therefore this is just a statement of fact. It is not a judgment about the situation in Scotland. So it's not about not accepting that judgment, it's about recognising that very important fact. The guidance, as I have said, and as anybody can look and see, was broadly similar in Scotland to England, and indeed in Wales with a Labour government. So this is nothing to do with politics, but there were some differences. So, for example, at a time when there were mixed views, if I can put it mildly, about the risks of asymptomatic transmission, our guidance from as early as 13th of March was recommending that residents remain in their rooms, and from the 26th of March recommending isolation, 14-day isolation of anyone discharged to a care home, even if they didn't have symptoms. So clearly the risk of asymptomatic transmission was in mind to some extent at that point. These are matters that will be fully scrutinised by the public inquiry under the convenership of Lady Poole, a High Court judge in Scotland, and if there are other processes brought in Scotland, then that scrutiny will be brought to bear there too. Of course, there has been analysis undertaken by Public Health Scotland of discharges to care homes, and the finding of that analysis was that there was no clear statistical evidence that hospital discharges were associated with care home outbreaks. Instead, it was care home size that was more strongly related to outbreaks. So that's the analysis that's been done so far, but it is right that there is full analysis and full scrutiny by the independent public inquiry whose work is now getting underway.
Anna Sarwar.
I'll just remind the First Minister, yes, families will be hearing the sympathies the First Minister has expressed, but they'll also hear the ducking and diving that's been expressed by the First Minister as well. So let's look. I'm sorry, Mr Spinney, you're right, it is a disgrace. Disgrace to those that lost a loved one in a care home. So let's look. I've already narrated the timeline that happened in Scotland, but let's look at the consequences of the shameful decision. In the first wave of the pandemic, 4,073 people died with COVID in Scotland. 1,900 of them were in care homes. That's almost 50%. And by the time the government acted, half of all care homes in Scotland had a COVID outbreak. First Minister, families have been through the heartbreak of losing a loved one. Many of them couldn't be there at the final moments. And it seems that the First Minister is suggesting that those families should perhaps go through the court system here in Scotland to get to the truth. So don't force those families to relive that heartache all over again, being dragged through the courts with the emotional toll that comes with it, having to spend thousands of pounds in order to get you to admit the truth. Do you finally accept your government's decisions and actions were unlawful, unreasonable, irrational and cost lives?
First Minister.
On an issue as serious as this, Anna Sarwar is shamefully I think, misrepresenting my words. I did not suggest that people should have to go to court. What I recognised was that people have a right, if they so choose, to go to court, and they may choose to do that. That was not a suggestion that they should. I believe people should get the answers to the questions that they have around all aspects of the handling of this pandemic without having to do that, which is why this government has set up an independent public inquiry chaired by a High Court judge. And Jackie Baillie, from a sedentary position, is asking me how long. Can I refer her to the Inquiries Act 2005? The conduct of the public inquiry and the rhythm of reporting and the time it takes for it to report is entirely a matter for the independence of that inquiry and not for ministers. And Jackie Baillie, from a sedentary position, I think should stop indulging in political commentary and actually engage in the importance of these issues. I don't have to be reminded of the numbers and the consequences of this pandemic. These facts and figures and the human consequences are embedded in my soul and will always be. That does not mean my decisions and my actions and those of my government should in any way not be subject to scrutiny. They should be subject to full independent scrutiny, and that is exactly what the independent public inquiry is going to do. That's what families deserve, and they deserve that that process takes place in a proper way, and I'm determined that they get that.